My goal tonight is just to basically give
You're good. I'm
just do
recording.
an overview, an overview and compression of my introduction to type class. So if you go to the next slide, it'd be great. So within graphic design, we need to understand that there's four basic methods of communication: person-to-person, TV, multimedia, radio, and print. And within person-to-person, you could see somebody, hear somebody, touch somebody, smell somebody. It's the most effective method of communication. And then paring down from there, within multimedia, television, excuse me, still being able to see and hear somebody, to be able to directly communicate a message. Then moving down further, where you're reducing those elements and sensitivities to radio, and then print. And that's primarily where my profession focuses on, and being able to understand how to best communicate a message on behalf of a client using only type and image in place of all those other senses and the other three aspects of communication. You can go to next slide. So what is graphic design? It's the integration of type and image to communicate a message. So you can go to the next slide. So within graphic design, we specialize in visual communications. We have a responsibility to communicate a message on behalf of a client to a specific demographic. In order to do that requires that we plan and analyze and create visual solutions to communicate a message that would resonate on behalf of that demographic. One of the challenges we have is ultimately to help bring organization to chaos. And design ultimately means to plan. Next slide. So in order to plan, one of the aspects of what we do is to help reduce the effort on the part of the reader to absorb, retain information. But that requires that we first, as communicators, define the problem, and then being able to describe that problem. That leads into the development of a design brief, which is shared with a client to make sure that we are understanding of what their needs are and that we're clear on who the demographic is. And then after that process, we embark in the creative process, visual development, and the solutions. But what's important for designers specifically to understand is that, you can't convey a message unless you have an intimate understanding of what that message is on behalf of a client. So ideas come from creativity and from what you know. And our role as a designer, as Chris Clemens' quote here indicates, is that we need to be aware of everything, and that we can't pull out of our heads what we have not put in. So it's critically important that we have an intimate understanding of who the client is, what they do, and who their demographic is. Next slide. So the first aspect of it is to define the problem, and making sure that you as a designer or a marketing person or advertising, whoever it may be, that typically the problem comes directly from the client. And we're there to help them navigate that process. And it begins with a number of questions, beginning with what are they trying to communicate and why? So they're the sender. What is it that they want to convey about themselves? Who needs the information and why? And this is the most important. The target demographic is it. Who are they based on their age, race, culture, religion, level of education, gender, and then what is it they know? Do they know anything new about the client? Do they need to know something new? And then gathering some information as far as, has the client communicated information like this in the past? And information gathering as far as collection of brochures, direct mail, and analysis of their websites and reports and such. And then looking at who their competition is and how they have solved their communication problems. And then looking at, have they been successful? Is there something that they're doing that, you can develop and expand upon that maybe they haven't thought of? But it helps define the scope of who they are. And then ultimately, how do you want the audience to respond? Do you want them to cry, laugh, buy something, learn something, next slide, or propose marriage? So within that, the integration of type and image. So typography is the arrangement of language. Next slide. and that we as designers have an obligation and responsibility to understand the author's conceptual structure. Next page. And then what the expectation is on the part of what they want to convey to the reader. Next slide. And we are the bridge between those two. And we have an obligation and a responsibility to understand what it is that the author is intending to communicate. Next slide. So talking about typography is, again, the design to honor the content, and really is one of the most important aspects of communication. And it can take multiple different forms as far as mood, tone, voice, but ultimately, how do you organize that information on a page? Next. And then imagery. Imagery obviously is incredibly powerful. An image, and the cliche of an image is worth 1,000 words. We use in tandem type and image that working together to convey that message, and understanding that people respond differently to an image. So type comes in as the clarifier for that message. Next slide. So this is a really good example from a publication by Philip Meggs that illustrates basic communication in the form of an image and type. So on the top row, you're seeing the same image of the same individual, but the language underneath changes. It is legible, it is readable, but it can be enhanced. At that point, it's rather stoic. It's not very explicit. On the second line, there's been an elevation of the messaging in the visual, where the context of the individual has changed based on their attire, their position, and their environment. But underneath, the type remains the same font, same size, same information. And then the last line is ultimately the importance of integrating type and image effectively based on fonts, scale, and proportion. So you're seeing the sort of traditional campaign signage where there's a large figure, professionally dressed or attired, use of a font, scale of their last name, over to a wanted poster, which is a reduction in the imagery that follows a template that we're typically normally seeing, over to the use of a different font family as far as a slab serif, and obviously a different image. So the last line is the ultimate objective of integrating type and image to convey a very specific message. Next. So in order to understand type, you need to understand the language of type and the terminology. Next slide. So one of the confusing aspects about type is the difference between a font and a typeface. And I think the best way to explain the difference is if you were to purchase a record, that the record is the font, and that the typefaces are the individual soundtracks on that particular record. So you're seeing here an example of different typefaces on the left and their weight within an extended font family, which I'll touch upon here in a second. Next slide. One of the things important to note that I'll reference later is the difference between a true versus fake, we'll just say italics or bold. If you're used to Microsoft Word and you want an element of text to be bold, you click on the B button. Or if you want it to be italic, you click on the italic button. The problem with that is that Microsoft Word is changing the attributes of a particular typeface versus an extended font family where there is a specific font designed to be italic or bold. Next slide. The other aspect is there's different characteristics of type that all conform to these basic standards. And that has to deal with the height of each character. So if you look at the bottom and the metrics on the side, where you're seeing the height of a cap and the A and the T, but more importantly, the X height, which is referred to the scale of the lowercase letter forms and the Y, the P, and the E. There's no universal standard where that X height is consistent. And then underneath that, where the type sits is referred to as a baseline. And then underneath there with the Y and the P, there are elements of characters that extend below the baseline, which are referred to as descenders. Next slide. All right. And then there are, again, different unique characteristics on the type. And one of those is the stress. And if you think about it, just using a different writing instrument and how the width and thickness of a stroke changes and the angle affects the letter form. Next slide. A terminal, which is the end point of a letter form. And this is one that's important to note when we get into the classifications. Next one. Serif. The two major classifications of type are serif and sans serif. And a serif is basically a spur or a tail that extends at a terminal of a letter. Next. And then the bracket is the shape that's created to connect that serif to a letter form. And good contrast is the thick and thin between letter forms. Next. The stroke. So that vertical stroke, same thing. What's the weight? What's the thickness? Next one. Descenders, I mentioned earlier, so that's an element of a character that extends below the baseline. Next one. Ascender is a portion of a character that extends above the X height of a character. And then the crossbar is the joinment between different letter forms in capitals, the strokes of a letter. Next. And then a counter. The counter is basically the negative space that's created between the form, but it's also not necessarily all proportionally closed. So if you look at the C letter form, it's also open. Next. And then typographic terminology with respect to color. This has absolutely nothing to do with the color of a font. It has to do with the weight of a font and the value of black and or grayscale that's created. So this example here is a comparison between two different font classifications, which I'll touch upon next, that are set in the same point size and the same leading, but the weight is uniquely different between those two classifications. Next. And then a loop. This to me is always interesting depending on the project that I'm working on. Sometimes I will make a choice based on the aesthetic of a character, particularly a loop, if there's a G, and a logo type, which is a form of an identity, if you go to the next slide. So just a wide variety of options. So based on aesthetics, sometimes you can make a choice about type based on that. Next one. So the basic classifications of type. Next slide. Old style, transitional, modern, serif, sans serif, slab serif, and graphic. Next slide. So old style. So this is where the terminology comes into play in being able to assess and understand and decode a particular font. So these have low contrast strokes, angled stresses, smaller X height, pear-shaped terminals, and smaller counters, and some examples of typefaces that classify as old style. Next one. Transitional, higher stroke contrast, near vertical access, larger X height, sharper serifs, and larger counters. Garamond, Baskerville, and Times. Pretty much everybody's familiar with Times. Next one. Modern. What's key here is there's an extreme contrast between thick and thin with the bracketing in a serif. And they're flat, and there's geometric counters. Bodoni being one of the more iconic fonts there. Next slide. And then sans serif, the absence of a serif. So there's no serifs, there's flat terminals, there's uniformity in the stroke thickness between thick and thin, and the X height is just a little bit larger. Next slide. Slab serif, subset of serif, much heavier. It's a hybrid between serif and sans serif. There's still consistency to some degree between stroke thickness, but they're much heavier. Next slide. And then graphic. These are unique, specialized typefaces. And this is typically the area of type that most students gravitate to because visually they're the most interesting to work with. Next slide. And what's important to note is the message that a graphic typeface can communicate when it's attached to a specific subject. So if you look at the O, for example, a stencil font, that has an underlining military theme. If you look at the B, it has an Art Deco futuristic look. If you look at the letter A, it has a Western feel. The R is a black letter, so Old English. The K being elegant and script. And then the J, something that's really, really aggressive. So you need to understand that when you get into graphic typefaces, they can communicate a specific message. Sometimes it works effectively if it's intended. Sometimes it can be the antithesis of what it is that you're trying to communicate. Next slide. All right, so once you get through and understand the complexity of different type classifications and the different messaging and the nuances of that, you've got to think about how you're going to structure the typesetting of a message. And that begins with a grid. And a grid allows you to plan for a page layout. The grid is predicated on the amount of information that's provided on the part of the client. It helps to compartmentalize and break information into smaller chunks. Typically, most people respond to grids as being somewhat limited, but that depends on your approach and use of a grid, which I'll talk about here in a minute. So next slide. So you think about a grid. We live in grids. Our neighborhoods, our cities are structured. They provide organization to help us navigate a space. An environment, next slide. From where we live and how we compartmentalize the space, from where we dine to where we relax to where we sleep. Next slide. It's also how we shop. There are different aisles for different products. So it's all about organization. Next slide. And it's really a good example of, particularly now with online shopping, that in this case, wide variety of products, but one is no more important than the other based on the scale and the use of a grid, that to some extent they're equal. So a large variety of information that's been unified using format and a grid. Next slide. So before we decide as designers how we are going to approach the use of this, we've got to understand and analyze the content to have a clear understanding of delivery, volume, and target audience. And then from there, beginning to think about the shell and the underlying architecture of how we're going to structure a page layout. And that begins with margins and establishment of a grid. Next slide. So first is determining what the margin, well, let me back up. First is deciding what the size of this document is going to be. How many pages are required? What's the physical size going to be to accommodate the amount of content that's required? And then from there, determine the margin spacing, whether it's something that's going to be in a booklet, a book itself, a brochure, a magazine. The margin sets the perimeters for a composition. Next page. So what you're seeing here is the division of a page into columns and rows. And one of the more challenging aspects of what I do is to get young designers to understand is that the absence of information doesn't lack structure. Everybody wants to fill up a page. So in this example and a few others are going to be following, what I want you to focus in on is the left-hand side of the individual rectangles and how the type on the right-hand side is integrated into that structure. And where you don't see information, it's not absence of information. There's structure there. It just happens to be the same color as whatever the background is. Next slide. So this is an example of understanding the formatting of type within a margin, within a grid, which would be singular, typically what you would use for a letter. Next slide. All right, so this is a 12-column grid. And the importance here, back to my previous statement where folks think that potentially grids are limiting, the more complex a grid is, the more flexible it is for the integration of type and image. So something like this with a particular website, a lot of information. Next slide. but it can be broken down and simplified into 3 columns. Next one. 2 columns. Next one. 4. Next. 6. Next. And then an example of that 12-column grid and how information is integrated into that layout to provide an underlying structure. Next page. Another example of a 2-column grid, but grids don't have to be the same width per column, even though to some extent these may be. But the integration on the right of the content, right, but also the use of the white space and seeing that there's still structure. And that top left-hand side, although it's void of information, there's still mass there. There's still substance there. Next slide. All right. And then within a page composition, in this case, a magazine layout, how you integrate and showcase how that type is integrated in a really complex structure to achieve alignment and hierarchy. So as a designer, it's important that you're working within a structure. If you're not, then you're going to encounter issues with not being sure where to place elements within a composition. And the use of a grid helps that. Next slide. All right. So the other aspect of this is how do you create visual interest using type? And that begins with first understanding the use of an extended font family. And I apologize that I'm unable to share my screen. I was going to do a demo on this, but a font family provides a designer with specific typefaces at different weights, which have different characteristics, whether it's bold, condensed, italic, extended, semi-bold, and really good type begins with the selection of an extended typeface. So underneath that, where you're looking at combinations to create visual variation using a type to create visual interest is the combination between thick and thin or black and condensed. Another way to do that is to mix different classifications with one another. The most classic is the example with Caslon and Future, where you're mixing serif and sans serif together, or underneath that with Franklin, Gothic, and a script font. The one thing that you want to avoid is mixing similar classifications. So using a font Helvetica with Futura, both being sans serif typefaces, there's not much of a distinction between the two typefaces or the two different fonts. I'm sorry. So that contrast, although it's occurring when thick and thin, isn't going to apply necessarily within the differences within the fonts. Next slide. All right, when picking type, you really want to make a choice based on fonts that meet the designation as an open typeface. And that's indicated with the diagonal. What an open typeface is, it allows for a font to work both on a Mac and a PC. In the old days, you could only use like a True Type or a PostScript that did not convert between a Mac or a PC. So the image on the top right-hand side, you're seeing differences in a font. Helvetica that has the open type icon on the right, and then Helvetica New, which is the same font family, but that particular font family is a True Type. So the recommendation is that you always select an open typeface. It also provides a lot of different attributes that are not easily accessible and actually are not accessible in some instances when it comes to ligatures, superscript, and other aspects of type. Next slide. Right, then moving on from there, thinking about the content. You've got to integrate information into a composition. And that begins with the line length and being aware of that you can create fatigue. You can discourage a reader from embarking on understanding, absorbing, and retaining the content if you've provided a layout where it looks taxing, it looks overwhelming. So line length is important. The one tip that I typically recommend to everybody is thinking about, limiting the character width per line to 40 to 60 characters, including spaces. So what you're seeing on the right is just the different variations and examples of that. If the line length's too short, it can just cause a lot of interruption, and it's not a fluid rhythm to the text. But if it's too long, it requires too much focus, too much attention, which results in fatigue. So how you present the content to the reader is critically important. Next slide. And then the alignment of that content. So what you're seeing here on the top left is left alignment, underneath right, centered, justified, top right-hand side, force justified. So what's important to focus on here is the length of the text, but the shape that is created at the end of the line. So if you look off to the bottom right where it says rag, there's a few little gray boxes. That is what I'm referring to, and it's the negative space that's created when you have big chunks of absence of information that causes your eye to fluctuate in between. And it's very difficult to navigate from the end of one line to the beginning of the next line when there's major inconsistencies with the rag. And off to the right is a better example of a more fluid structure. In addition, some basic like type crimes would be an orphan that you want to avoid, where that's one word on a line by itself. And if you notice, following that word in that period, there's a big, long white space. So that's a rectangle. Or a widow, where you have multiple columns of type, and there's one word that is moved up to the top of the corresponding column that's isolated and by itself. Those two things are indicators, particularly for a designer, that they have not developed a sensitivity to typesetting. And then lastly, on the bottom left, justification. There's two differences. There's justified and there's force justified. The one on the bottom left, if you notice that the rag on the right is just a really nice, smooth, clean, sharp edge. And if you look in the top right-hand corner where it's force justified, what happens there is, regardless of the words on that line, it will fill that space and it starts to open up gaps between words. And those are referred to as rivers, and it activates the white space. So they could serve as visual interrupters to the text. So you want to avoid rivers. You want to understand that there's focus that needs to be attention to rags, and you want to avoid the use of orphans and widows. Next slide. And then leading. Leading is the spacing between lines of text. And this is just an example of using the same font with different applications of different leading values. The font on the first is a little bit compressed. The second column is a little bit more open, third, so on and so forth. So if you can create something where the leading is too compressed, you can impede readability, particularly if you look on the bottom left, and that's overlapping ascenders and descenders. This is major. This is like a major type crime within graphic design and typesetting, where you have one character that descends below the baseline, touching the ascender that extends beyond the X height of the next line. So I've always subscribed to the practice of using this ratio that whatever the point size is, add 2 to determine what the leading is as a starting point. Next slide. Next is kerning and ligatures. Kerning has to do with the spacing between letters, and it's really, really important. This is best illustrated by the example on the top for a massage therapist. So the designer wasn't paying attention to the spacing, and it looks like massage the rapist, all because of poor kerning. So we need to be aware of the spacing between letters, and how do we go about adjusting them? Ligatures are unique letter combinations of a double F, double I, FL, FI, and then replacing those with letter forms that were developed by Gutenberg to help combine those letter forms to improve readability. And off to the right are just kerning pairs. There are certain combinations where designers need to be aware of. That spacing needs to be manually adjusted to ensure that there's no gap between characters. Next slide. And then final, looking at typographic contrast as far as color to ensure that there's ease of readability, but ultimately the legibility of the typeface that you've selected. Next slide. So one of my favorite publications is Thinking with Type. This is a really good example of how do you use one font family to create typographic variation when typesetting that's clean and easily navigatable. So you're seeing the use of small caps, or I'm sorry, all caps, but they're set at the same height as the X height of the lowercase letter forms, the use of indents, the use of alignment. Next slide. This is a better example just from one of my previous resources. Same thing, same font, use of all lowercase, really nice clean rags, use of scale. So this is an example of how do you use one font family to create typographic variation, which adds visual interest. Next slide. In this example, it's the classic combination of mixing serif and sans serif. So the headings and the categories are all set in serif, and then subsets are in sans serifs, and then the numerals are set in serif. So it's a really nice balance between thick and thin, weight and contrast. Next slide. And then looking at this as far as typesetting from an annual report of mixing those two different combinations in addition to color. So the key point is, although there's typographic variation that's occurring, ultimately unity is being achieved through the consistency and use of an extended font family based on two different classifications. Next slide. One of my favorite books is by Matthew Carter. This goes into experimental, dynamic, and expressive type. So beyond typesetting, where you're looking at direct communication of information, how do you activate and energize type? So I always like this matrix as far as different combinations to break the rules with regard to typesetting, whether it be combinations of outlines, use of shapes, filling textures. Next slide. So these are just examples of that and the wide variety of different techniques that you can apply to type through pattern, changing kerning, changing leading, changing fonts, using different shapes, skewing type, outlining type, using thick and thin in scale and combination. So looking at just a wide variety of options that you have to arrive at a unique combination. So the couple ones that I want you to focus on are like this example here, this one, and the next slide. Go ahead. So you're seeing that application. You're seeing the mixing of different typographic techniques and compositions. And then within brand identity and logo types. Next page. Same thing, the use of type within shape. The use of, with Toys R Us, the inversion of the letter form R. Within Michaels, combination of a script font that's offset by a contrasting sans serif font. With MasterCard, the use of all lowercase. AirTrans, use of italic and regular. Within Pepsi, integration of type nuts or new identity within a shape. And then Dell with the skewing and changing the angle of the E. And then the last option with the brand here, mixing a serif and a sans serif. So this is typically where most students are focused in on as far as expressive type. But it's important to understand that typography is essential to conveying a message. So that's the end of the presentation, RJ. I know I had 40 minutes. I think I'm right on the money.
Yeah, I think so. You're good. Thank you, Rich. What do any of you have any questions? Very comprehensive as usual.
It's a lot. It's compressed. It's a lot.
That's the compressed version.
Yeah. I mean, look, my hope is that, look, if you could walk away from the recording or the session with an understanding of how to create typographic variation using one font family, that's important. I've always referred to as like typographic diarrhea with students who are just trying to mix and create sort of this eclectic, random type thing. But before you can get to that, you need to understand the nuances of type selection, the characteristics, the classifications, and such. No
And
questions.
well, one thing I was going to say is all of what he said, folks, absolutely applies to the interactive context. Even your examples of showing the grid with websites, and that's so important. And typography on the internet, it changes every day, I swear. Like, you're going to find some of the typefaces on like your desktop machine are not going to work online, but Google, especially in Adobe now, are starting to make a lot of those fonts web-based. And one of the things that you would need to consider with a web-based experience using specialized type is that every single user on the planet will need to download that typeface. And right now, what actually happens is when you load up a website with specialized typeface, your computer will call Adobe or Google and load it in the background, not actually on your computer, but will load it in your browser so you can see that specific typeface rendered correctly. But if you try to, if you expect to work on that in any other program, it won't necessarily work. So, font universality in this respect is also a really critical concern. And, a lot of the typefaces that are out there that you can use for your websites aren't even the best. They're not, how do those fonts look like on a desktop, a laptop, a tablet, a phone? Serifs, you're not seeing a whole lot of serifs on apps on your phone anymore because of, to Rich's point, because of the visual information that the end user would have to download, or even just to interpret and understand all those little details just to understand what it's saying. So that's why you're seeing a lot of sans serifs. And, I don't know, Rich, what your opinion is on this, but the more sans serifs you see out there in the world, it feels like it's more homogenous, and the more sans serifs, you lose character.
Oh, you do. And most people make selections based on one font rather than an extended font family. So there's no variation there. So you're limited to one weight, which in that aspect doesn't provide the visual interest. But I wasn't aware of that, RJ.
Yeah. And one thing that is also interesting,
If I can
many,
interrupt you, is that
yeah,
applied? I mean, like the new one, like the basics, like Helvetica or Times New Roman. I'm assuming those are out there. But if it's some type or a font from the font that's specialized, is that the case where it has to be set up in that manner if somebody doesn't have their on their device? No
If you
kidding.
don't have the specific font on your device, you will not be able to see it as it was coded in the website. Now, fonts like Helvetica, for example,
Yeah.
they're license protected. So what Google and Adobe will do is they'll make their own version of Helvetica. And like with Google, you can download that for free, but if you're not an Adobe user, you won't necessarily have access to it. So you get an
Okay.
extended license for it if it's an Adobe font.
I wasn't aware of that.
There are so many branding agencies now that are choosing their typefaces based on whether or not they've been made web optimized. So
Okay.
if you go to Google Fonts and you see the font Rubik, that is the typeface that is used in like a majority of Pitt's branding.
Okay.
And that choice was made because of the need to have web accessible typography. And it's just downloaded into your browser straight from Google.
Okay.
So, that's kind of where the future is heading on those things. But, even with those font families, you're not necessarily seeing a whole lot of variety. You'll get your bold italics, you'll get maybe a light, medium, and black, but you're not going to get like a whole ton of nuance.
Okay.
So they're really, really limited font families.
And I
So,
apologize, I wasn't able to share my screen because I was going to go through
oh,
that whole
that's
process.
okay. You can,
Especially like, it wasn't the same, especially like dumb type, where I know you can make some choices in like Microsoft Word, but if you want something bold, you hit the B button.
right.
And there are decisions being made there that alter the font where it wasn't designed that way. So that's something that I think that the majority of people aren't really informed about.
So, the the final thing I would add to this is that everything that Rich communicated about type is just as important in digital design as it is in print-based design, and even design in physical spaces, and in design in three-dimensional digital spaces. So thinking about putting your metaverse head on and your VR sets, like typography is typography, regardless of the medium. It is an entire discipline unto itself, and it needs to be carefully managed and taken care of. Because at the end of the day, readability, legibility, these are functions that of type that if it's not legible, then it's not good design. It's regardless of the medium. So what do you folks think? Anyone scared of typography?
I never knew typography was this complex. I always thought it was just like fonts, but I didn't know like companies claim fonts and everything. It's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
It's a complex topic.
It really is. And there are some people that they'll get, especially in Europe, I think there are like degrees in typography. And the other thing is that it's in a very old practice. Thinking about Gutenberg and the invention of the printing press, like we're going that far back. So
I think most people, like, back in the Middle Ages, if you owned a book, that was a sign of wealth, and knowledge was isolated. And that transformation didn't happen until Gutenberg invented, movable type in that press. So that was revolutionary. And I think most people overlook that based on where we are now, how free information is available to us.
Rich, Julia says here, I'm taking your graphic communication class in the summer. Excited to learn more about the dynamics of typography. And, I told her separately that I'll give her some good insults to throw your way.
Yeah, no, you have to.
From
Looking
me.
forward to it. Yeah. Those of you that know, RJ and I have a storied history with one another as far as educators.
That's right. Well, I'm glad that you're excited, Julia. That's great. Anyone else have any thoughts? Otherwise, we can take a break and we can wait for Patricia to show up, and she'll talk about designing for social media. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you, Rich.
RJ, listen, I appreciate the opportunity. I apologize for the technical issues. I'm going to get on that this week. Always a pleasure to see you, buddy.
Likewise.
Pleasure to see
Have a
you,
good
everybody.
night.
Thank you for the questions. Yeah, you enjoy your evening.
You as well. Talk soon.